The story of Japan's fatal error does not begin with war. It begins with pride, the quiet kind that grows over generations, rooted in survival, discipline, and tradition. For centuries, Japan had been an island apart, a nation bound by samurai codes and sacred mountains, by emperors seen as divine, and peasants who served with unspoken loyalty. Its people lived under the rhythm of honor and obedience, shaped by the belief that every man had a duty, every family a place, and every life a purpose. But as the 19th century closed, the winds of the world shifted. Western empires carved Asia like a map drawn in greed, and Japan stood watching. To remain silent, it feared, was to vanish. The Meiji Restoration changed everything. In the late 1800s, Japan tore off its isolation like an old skin. Samurai swords gave way to rifles. Temples echoed with the clang of steel foundries. The sons of farmers became soldiers and engineers. Within a generation, the nation leapt from feudalism to modernity. Trains roared through rice fields, and Tokyo's skyline bloomed with smokestacks. The West looked on in astonishment, a once sleeping culture awakening with frightening speed. But inside that transformation hid a dangerous conviction that discipline and unity could overcome any weakness, that spirit could substitute for size, and that Japan, unlike China or Korea, would never again kneel before foreign powers. Victory fed that belief. The war against China in 1895 proved Japan's new strength. 10 years later, the Russo-Japanese War stunned the world, an Asian nation defeating a European empire for the first time. Newspapers hailed Japan as the rising sun of modern warfare. To its people, it felt like destiny fulfilled. But pride has a way of muting caution. Every triumph whispered the same illusion, that Japan's will was unbreakable, its strategy flawless, and its cause righteous. The myth of invincibility took root, and like all myths, it blinded those who worshipped it. By the 1930s, that myth had grown into a national creed. The world was gripped by depression. Hunger and anger spread like wildfire. Militarists in Tokyo promised salvation through conquest. They preached that Japan's destiny lay not in peace, but in expansion, to seize resources, protect Asia from Western domination, and fulfill what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To many, it sounded noble. To others, it was a polite mask for empire. Soldiers marched in perfect rhythm through the streets, schoolchildren bowed to portraits of the emperor, and newspapers spoke only of glory. The ancient code of Bushido, once a moral compass for warriors, became a political weapon, demanding obedience without question. In 1931, Japanese troops seized Manchuria. In 1937, they invaded China, bringing unimaginable destruction to cities like Nanjing. Western powers protested, but Japan ignored them. The army believed that hesitation was weakness, that compromise insulted the samurai soul. Each victory confirmed what the generals wanted to believe, that the empire's courage made it unstoppable. Yet even as they advanced, Japan's Achilles heel was already visible. The war machine devoured fuel, oil, and steel at a rate the islands could not supply. Every bullet fired, every ship launched, chained Japan more tightly to its need for foreign resources. By 1940, Japan faced a choice: retreat or gamble everything. The U.S. embargo on oil threatened to suffocate the empire's lifeblood. To Tokyo's leaders, surrendering economic control meant humiliation, a betrayal of the very pride that had built modern Japan. In private meetings, admirals and ministers debated with feverish logic: strike first or be strangled slowly. Logic lost to pride. They convinced themselves that America, soft and divided, would sue for peace after one decisive blow. Thus began the path toward the empire's greatest mistake. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was born less from strategy than from emotion, a mixture of desperation and belief in invincibility. Japan's navy, disciplined and daring, prepared the assault with surgical precision. Pilots rehearsed for months, whispering prayers to ancestors before flight. On the morning of December 7, 1941, they soared out of the clouds over Hawaii. Torpedoes sliced through harbor waters. Explosions turned battleships into burning tombs. and in a few hours, the Pacific's calm transformed into chaos. The Japanese command celebrated a flawless victory. They believed they had shattered America's will before it could awaken. But they had misunderstood the enemy and the age they lived in. Modern war was no longer about decisive moments. It was about endurance. Pearl Harbor destroyed ships, but not spirit. America's industrial might, vast, methodical, impersonal, was the opposite of Japan's. Where Japan worshipped sacrifice, America worshipped production. Within months, shipyards that had once built passenger liners were turning out carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh thundered day and night, powered by the fury of a nation now unified by loss. Back in Tokyo, the euphoria of victory began to fade. Intelligence officers warned of America's potential output. Economists spoke of dwindling reserves. Yet the leadership, trapped by ideology, refused to see. They told themselves that Japanese courage would balance American machines. Bushido would triumph over steel. It was not arrogance alone, it was faith. The empire's rulers believed the war was a moral contest, a test of national soul. They could not imagine losing, because to lose meant dishonor beyond words. Throughout 1942, Japan expanded rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Philippines, the rising sun flag flew unchallenged. Civilians cheered, soldiers sang marching songs that promised eternal glory. But the empire's reach outpaced its grasp. Every mile gained required men and supplies Japan could not replace. The Navy's elite pilots, inexperienced masters of the Zero fighter, began to fall faster than they could be trained. Fuel shortages forced ships to ration movement. Food shortages starved both soldiers and civilians. The empire was winning itself to death. In these early years, the fatal error still seemed invisible. Victories masked the rot beneath. Yet within the Imperial High Command, a few voices trembled with unease. Admiral Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of Pearl Harbor, knew the truth. He warned that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he had no expectation of success. He understood that Japan had gambled not just against a nation, but against time. When Midway came, the clash that would tilt the Pacific forever, his prophecy unfolded with merciless precision. 4 Japanese carriers, Agaki, Kaga, Tsuruyu, and Haruyu, erupted in flames. Experienced pilots, the empire's most skilled, vanished into smoke and sea. Japan lost more than ships that day. It lost the future. But even then, Tokyo refused to yield. The government told its people the battle was a minor setback. Pride demanded illusion. And so the empire pressed on, blind to the approaching storm. At home, propaganda painted every death as noble sacrifice. Mothers were told to rejoice when sons fell. Children were taught that loyalty to the emperor was higher than life itself. Factories worked under candlelight. Food grew scarce, yet songs of victory played on the radio. The machinery of belief kept running long after logic stopped. And under it all, the core mistake deepened, the conviction that spirit alone could triumph over reality. That mistake, that worship of will over wisdom, was the seed of the empire's doom. It was not born in a single meeting or battle. It was woven into the culture itself. Pride disguised as virtue, sacrifice mistaken for strength. It led Japan to strike at powers it could not outproduce, to occupy lands it could not hold, and to wage war it could not afford. As 1942 faded into 1943, cracks widened. The once invincible Japanese soldier now fought on starvation rations. The skies which had once been theirs belonged to American bombers. Commanders sent messages wrapped in poetry and desperation. We are holding, but barely. Supplies gone, morale high. They could not admit defeat. Language itself had been chained by honor. And so, Japan marched forward, step by bleeding step, into the jaws of inevitability. The sun that had once risen over a triumphant empire now began its slow descent. Yet in 1942, few in Tokyo could see it. Japan stood at the height of its conquests, an empire stretching from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma. from the oil fields of Borneo to the coral reefs of the Solomon Islands. To many, it seemed the dream had come true. Asia united under the rising sun. The newspapers called it divine destiny. The generals called it inevitability. The people believed. But beneath the banners and the songs, the empire's arteries were already bleeding dry. The very victories that had fed Japan's pride were now consuming it from within. At the heart of the problem was a number, one that the leaders refused to face. For every plane Japan built, America built 12. For every ton of oil Japan refined, the Allies refined hundreds. War is not only a contest of courage, it is a contest of capacity. And Japan's capacity was finite. Yet the war machine demanded infinite fuel, infinite steel, infinite men. Supply lines stretched across vast oceans, guarded by too few ships, stocked by Allied submarines. Every convoy that reached its destination became a small miracle. Every one that didn't meant factories silent and planes grounded. The empire had grown too large to feed itself, too fragile to endure the grind of total war. Still, the high command refused to yield. To question victory was to question honor, and honor was sacred. So they pushed harder. Orders came from Tokyo to hold every inch of conquered land, no matter the cost. It was a decision born not from strategy, but from psychology. The same national pride that had propelled Japan forward now refused to let it turn back. Retreat was unthinkable. Even tactical withdrawal was painted as cowardice. Generals sent messages dripping with fatalism. "We will defend to the last man." And so they did. The empire began to eat its own sons. In the jungles of New Guinea, men starved on muddy hillsides, their uniforms rotting from rain and sweat. On the island of Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers, exhausted, half-mad from malaria, launched suicidal night attacks against entrenched American Marines. Their courage was unquestionable. Their fate was inevitable. The Americans had food, medicine, artillery, air cover. The Japanese had hunger and faith. When defeat came, Tokyo refused to believe it. Radio broadcasts declared heroic resistance, even as entire divisions vanished into the jungle. Each loss was explained away. Each defeat blamed on luck or weather or temporary setbacks. No one dared say aloud that the empire was overextended, that its economy was collapsing, that its fuel reserves could not sustain another year of war. To do so would mean betraying the very ideology that defined them, the Bushido Code twisted into nationalism. Dying for the emperor was still considered the highest honor. Living long enough to question the war was shameful. By mid-1943, the illusion of invincibility began to fracture. The Battle of Midway had not just cost Japan 4 carriers. It had shattered the myth that divine spirit ensured victory. Yet, even in failure, the leadership refused humility. They turned to desperation instead. Factories ramped up production beyond capacity, conscripting students and women into labor. Rations shrank to starvation levels. The people were told to endure, gaman, the sacred patience of suffering. Every sacrifice was portrayed as another stone in the path toward glory. But glory does not fill fuel tanks. As American carriers swept across the Pacific, Japan's fleets grew thinner. Each naval battle was a gamble Japan could no longer afford. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as the Americans called it, marked another turning point. Hundreds of Japanese planes rose to meet the enemy, piloted by brave but inexperienced men, many barely trained. They were shot down almost to the last. The sea was littered with oil, debris, and dreams. In Tokyo, silence followed the news. The admirals spoke of honorable losses. But everyone knew Japan's naval air power had died that day. Meanwhile, at home, the consequences of the empire's expansion came crashing down. The blockade tightened. Merchant ships sank faster than they could be built. Rice became scarce. Coal ran out. Families in cities like Osaka and Yokohama burned furniture for heat. Yet propaganda posters still proclaimed victory. 100 million hearts beating as one, they said. A slogan that masked desperation with poetry. Behind closed doors, government officials knew the truth. Japan was trapped in a war it could not win, but from which it could not withdraw. The army's solution was simple and tragic. Fight harder. The doctrine of gyokusai, honorable death like shattered jewels, became official policy. Soldiers were told that surrender was worse than death, that capture shamed one's family and emperor. On every island, from Tarawa to Saipan, that belief took root like a poison. When Allied troops landed, Japanese defenders fought to the last. Civilians were told to follow their example. Mothers leapt off cliffs with their children in their arms, believing surrender would disgrace them. Even as the empire crumbled, its people clung to the illusion that honor was eternal and defeat only temporary. But inside Japan's leadership, cracks appeared. Some officers began to question the path they had taken. Admiral Yamamoto's death in 1943, shot down by American fighters, hit the nation like an omen. He had warned them from the start, to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. His prophecy had come true. The giant was now fully awake. Allied bombers struck deeper each month. Factories burned, cities trembled. But Tokyo still dreamed of negotiation from strength, of one great battle that would restore honor. That battle never came. Instead came the slow, grinding death of empire. The Americans did not fight for glory. They fought for annihilation. Their war was industrial, systematic, relentless. Each island taken became another step closer to Japan itself. The strategy of island hopping bypassed strongholds, cutting them off until their defenders starved. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died not in combat, but in silence, their graves unmarked by anything but the jungle's whisper. The empire's commanders still sent reports claiming victory. They could not admit otherwise. To do so was to confess that the entire war had been a mistake, that everything, from the first bullet fired in China to the final torpedo launched in the Pacific, had been built on pride and blindness. In late 1944, the reality became undeniable. The loss of the Philippines shattered Japan's defensive line. Its access to oil was gone. Its navy was crippled beyond repair. When the Imperial fleet sailed to Leyte Gulf to stop the American invasion, it met not destiny, but destruction. The battle raged for days. Battleships against bombers. Courage against inevitability. Japanese sailors fought with the same valor that had stunned the world decades earlier. But valor could not stop the future. One by one, the empire's proudest warships sank beneath the waves. The survivors watched their flags disappear into the deep, carrying with them the illusion of invincibility. From the ashes of that defeat rose a new symbol of despair, the kamikaze. Born from desperation, baptized in fanaticism, these pilots became Japan's final weapon. They believed their death could turn the tide, that one life sacrificed could destroy a ship, that mass sacrifice could balance industrial weakness. They flew with letters to their mothers, with prayers whispered to the emperor, and with faces calm as dawn. When they struck, they burned bright and brief, a tragic fusion of faith and futility. To the world they appeared insane, But within Japan, they were honored as divine spirits, souls of purity, beyond reason. The military had found a way to turn hopelessness into propaganda. And yet, even as these young men crashed into steel walls of American ships, Japan's leaders knew the truth. The war was lost. They could not say it aloud, not to their people, not even to each other. The emperor, silent and distant, remained a figure of near divine stillness. Around him, generals spoke in riddles, reports framed in half-truths. Reality had become treason. By the end of 1944, Japan was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to exist. Every ship sunk, every city bombed, every island lost was another step toward the inevitable. And yet the empire fought on, not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. The fatal error had metastasized. The belief that death was preferable to adaptation, that honor could replace wisdom. Pride had once built the empire. Now it ensured its destruction. In Tokyo's war rooms, men spoke of sacrifice as if it were strategy. They forgot that sacrifice, when it becomes an end in itself, ceases to serve any purpose at all. It becomes worship of death. Japan's leaders, trapped by their own mythology, mistook annihilation for nobility. And in doing so, they condemned their nation to flames. As 1945 approached, the empire stood surrounded, starving and bleeding. The once glorious rising sun flag fluttered over ruins and empty promises. Yet still, the generals spoke of victory. Still, the radio promised miracles. Still, the people bowed and believed. The world was changing faster than Japan could imagine, and the empire that had sought mastery of the Pacific was now drowning in the very ocean it had once claimed to rule. The fatal error was no longer hidden. It was visible in every starving soldier, every shattered city, every mother who wept beneath a burning sky. But the final reckoning, the fire that would end an age, was still to come. By 1945, Japan was a nation fighting ghosts. Its armies were scattered across half the Pacific, its navy crippled, its cities burning. Yet still, Tokyo whispered the same refrain: endure, fight, die with honor. The people obeyed because they had been taught from birth that loyalty was absolute. Even when the air itself turned against them, filled with the hum of American bombers, they believed the emperor would protect them. The truth was harder to accept. The gods had gone silent, and the empire was already dead. Every night, the sky over Japan became a canvas of fire. The American B-29 bombers came not in dozens, but in hundreds, their bellies heavy with incendiaries. Their mission was not precision, it was annihilation. They flew high above the reach of Japan's dwindling defenses, methodically erasing cities one by one. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, names that had once been proud centers of industry and art, became infernos. Entire neighborhoods melted into flame, wooden houses collapsed like paper lanterns, and rivers glowed red with reflection. On March 9, 1945, Tokyo itself became a nightmare. Operation Meeting House, the most devastating air raid in human history, unleashed over 300 B-29s upon the sleeping capital. Within hours, more than 100,000 civilians were dead. The firestorm was so intense that it boiled canals and burned the air from lungs. Witnesses recalled the wind howling like a living thing, mothers clutching infants as the flames chased them through the streets. It was not war. It was hell given form. And yet, Japan did not surrender. The government censored the scale of destruction. Newspapers downplayed casualties. Survivors were told to endure with gratitude. The army claimed the raids had only strengthened the people's resolve. But in truth, the people were breaking. The code of gamen, endurance, was stretched beyond human limits. Families buried what was left of their homes and prayed for peace,
while the high command in Tokyo continued to speak of final victory. In the imperial palace, Hirohito remained distant, surrounded by courtiers who shielded him from despair. He was still revered as divine, an unearthly figure beyond human suffering, but even he could feel the tremor of doom in the air. Reports from the front were grim. The Philippines had fallen. Iwo Jima, defended by 20,000 soldiers who vowed never to surrender, had been reduced to ash. None survived to tell the story. The Americans raised their flag over Mount Suribachi, and with it a message. Japan's homeland was next. Okinawa followed, a battle so savage it seemed to defy reason. The island was Japan's last line before the mainland, and its defense was meant to be a symbol of unbreakable resolve. The army ordered every man, woman, and child to resist. Schoolkids carried grenades. Housewives sharpened bamboo spears. The sky filled with kamikaze planes, thousands of them, each carrying a pilot willing to die. They struck ships with suicidal precision, sinking dozens, killing thousands. But even as the Americans bled, they advanced. Okinawa became a graveyard for both sides. Over 200,000 people died, soldiers, civilians, children. The Japanese command called it glorious sacrifice. To the survivors, it was apocalypse. General Ushima, the island's commander, performed ritual seppuku when defeat became certain. Before his death, he left a final message: "We have fought with honor. The rest is up to the emperor." But there was nothing left for the emperor to command. Japan's armies were broken, its navy gone, its skies owned by the enemy. The home islands were isolated, the factories silent. The only weapon left was belief, and even that was fading. For the first time, whispers of surrender reached Tokyo's war council. Some ministers argued that to continue fighting was to invite total extinction. Others, led by General Anami and the militarists, demanded one final battle. They believed that if Japan could make the Americans bleed enough, the Allies would agree to a negotiated peace. It was delusion, but it was all they had left. The plan was called Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive. Every soldier, every civilian, every child would be mobilized to repel the coming invasion. Bamboo spears were distributed to women. Schoolgirls trained to throw grenades. Teenagers practiced bayonet drills in playgrounds. Japan was preparing to die as one. The fatal error, the belief that death was nobler than adaptation, that honor could replace wisdom, had now infected the entire nation. The same code that once inspired samurai to live with honor had become a commandment to die without reason. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Allies prepared for invasion, but they dreaded what they saw. Intelligence estimated that an assault on Japan would cost over 1 million Allied lives, and many times that number of Japanese civilians. The beaches of Kyushu and Honshu would become killing grounds. President Truman and his generals knew that conventional victory might destroy Japan completely. They needed another way to end the war, one that would shatter the illusion of divine protection once and for all. That way came from fire and atoms. In July 1945, at a remote desert site in New Mexico, the world entered a new age. The first atomic bomb exploded with the light of a second sun, and humanity's capacity for destruction transcended imagination. The weapon was unlike anything seen before, silent until it spoke, and when it spoke in fire. The message was clear. The next war would not be fought by armies or fleets, but by gods of science. The first of these weapons fell upon Hiroshima. The city awoke to the sound of sirens, the hum of engines, then a blinding white flash. In an instant, 70,000 lives vanished. The blast flattened everything within miles. Those who survived were burned beyond recognition, their shadows seared onto walls. The river filled with bodies seeking water that could no longer cool them. It was the end of a city, the death of innocence, and the proof that the world had changed forever. Still, Tokyo hesitated. The army refused to believe that a single bomb could cause such devastation. They assumed the Americans only had one. 3 days later, Nagasaki proved them wrong. Another sun rose, another city fell. Tens of thousands more died. Even then, some in the War Council insisted on continuing the fight. They argued that surrender would dishonor the emperor, that Japan should endure even if it meant national suicide. But for the first time, Emperor Hirohito broke his silence. In a calm voice, he told his ministers, "We must endure the unendurable." It was over. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice was broadcast across the nation, the first time his people had ever heard him speak. He did not say the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of ending the war. His words were veiled, poetic, yet their meaning was unmistakable. Japan's divine mission had ended in ruin. The empire that had risen to dominate Asia now knelt in ashes. For the people, the announcement was surreal. Some wept in relief, others refused to believe it. Many soldiers, unable to accept defeat, took their own lives. In remote outposts across the Pacific, isolated garrisons continued to fight, unaware the war was over. It would take years before the last holdouts emerged from the jungles, still loyal to a dream that had died long ago. As the Allied occupation began, Japan was forced to confront the magnitude of its destruction. Cities lay in ruins, millions were homeless.
Children scavenged for food among the rubble. Disease spread. But amid the despair, something extraordinary began to happen. The same spirit that had once driven the empire's conquest now turned inward, toward rebuilding, toward survival. The Bushido of war transformed into the discipline of peace. Factories reopened, not to build weapons, but to make tools, radios, bicycles. The people endured, and in endurance, they found redemption. Japan's fatal error had not been ambition. It had not even been aggression. It had been arrogance, the belief that spirit alone could overcome reality, that honor could replace reason, that divine destiny exempted them from the consequences of human pride. It was an error repeated throughout history by every empire that mistook conviction for invincibility. The bombs had ended the war, but it was pride that had begun it. And as Japan looked across the smoking ruins of its cities, it finally understood that no empire, no matter how ancient, no matter how devoted, can escape the truth that every victory built on denial eventually becomes its own destruction. In that realization lay the seeds of transformation. From the ashes of surrender, Japan would rise again, not as a conqueror, but as a nation reborn. Its strength would no longer come from steel or fire, but from wisdom, innovation, and humility. The same discipline that once trained warriors would now build a society of peace. The empire had fallen, but its people would endure. When the war finally ended, silence spread across Japan like an unfamiliar fog. The guns stopped. The air raid sirens no longer wailed. The night skies, once filled with the glare of flames, became still. But beneath that stillness lay the weight of loss so vast that even words seemed too small. Cities lay in ash. Families vanished. Entire generations were marked by scars that could never fully fade. What remained was not victory or defeat. It was survival. And survival, for the first time, was enough. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor not as a god, but as a man. On August 15, 1945, his words poured through radios across the nation. Soft, trembling, formal. Many listeners could not understand the imperial language he used, but they understood the tone. It was the sound of surrender. Men wept openly. Women clutched their children. Soldiers knelt, unsure whether to pray or curse. The divine emperor, whom they had been told was eternal, had spoken of enduring the unendurable. In that single moment, centuries of myth dissolved. American forces landed not as destroyers, but as occupiers, and, unexpectedly, as rebuilders. General Douglas MacArthur stepped ashore in Tokyo, his tall figure in contrast to the bowed heads of officials greeting him. He came not to enslave, but to reshape. His mission was clear: to dismantle the machinery of war, to erase the cult of militarism, and to lay the foundations of democracy on the ruins of an empire. It was an experiment unlike any before, to turn a nation forged in obedience to one ruled by consent. At first, distrust filled every corner. Japanese civilians expected humiliation, even revenge. But the Americans brought food, medicine, and order. They rebuilt railways, reopened schools, restored electricity. Slowly, the fear gave way to disbelief, and then to gratitude. MacArthur allowed the emperor to remain, not as a deity, but as a symbol, a living bridge between the old Japan and the new. Meanwhile, in courtrooms far from the bombed streets, the reckoning began. The Tokyo war crimes trials exposed the horrors hidden by propaganda. Massacres, forced labor, human experiments. For the first time, citizens heard the testimonies of victims. It was painful, shameful, and necessary. Some refused to believe. Others bowed their heads in silence. The illusion of noble conquest died there, replaced by the sobering truth that Japan's own fatal error had brought suffering not only to others, but to itself. But from that guilt, something profound began to grow. The generation that had survived the bombings and the hunger began to rebuild with quiet determination. They no longer fought for the emperor, they fought for their children. Brick by brick, rail by rail, Japan began to rise again. The ashes that had once symbolized defeat became the soil for renewal. In Hiroshima, where the shadow of one bomb still lingered on the walls, survivors, the hibakusha, began to tell their stories. They did not cry for vengeance, they pleaded for peace. From their suffering grew a movement that would make Japan one of the most pacifist nations in history. Schools taught children not about glory in battle, but about the sanctity of life. Monuments rose not for generals, but for the lost. Every August, the city lights lanterns on the river, each flame drifting away as a silent prayer for a world without war. Economically, Japan transformed faster than anyone believed possible. By the 1950s, its factories were humming again, not to build warships, but cameras, radios, and cars. The same precision that once designed fighter planes now perfected consumer goods. In a single generation, Japan became a technological giant. Cities like Tokyo and Osaka rose from rubble into skylines of steel and glass. The world watched in awe as a nation once synonymous with destruction became a symbol of discipline, innovation, and rebirth. And yet beneath that progress, the memories of war never fully vanished. Veterans haunted by guilt and trauma lived quietly in the shadows. Families still searched for the remains of fathers and sons lost on distant islands. The pain did not disappear, it was simply carried, folded into the fabric of a culture that had learned endurance the hard way. Japan did not forget its fatal error. It turned remembrance into a lesson. The Bushido spirit, once a call to die for honor, was reborn as a code for living with integrity. Where once it demanded sacrifice, it now inspired craftsmanship, precision, and respect for work. In boardrooms, in classrooms, in art and industry, the echoes of that ancient code remained, but softened by wisdom. The sword was replaced by the pen, the bow by the handshake, and the battlefield by the marketplace. By the 1970s, Japan was no longer the defeated nation of ashes. It was a world power again, peaceful, industrious, respected. Its culture spread across the world. Films, technology, design, philosophy. The same people that had once faced annihilation now led in innovation. But even at the height of success, Japanese leaders spoke with humility. They knew the cost of arrogance. They remembered the firestorms, the famine, the silence of surrender. The empire had died, and in its death, it had saved the soul of a nation. Decades later, when Hirohito died in 1989, millions mourned, not as worshippers of a god, but as citizens remembering a man who had witnessed both Japan's darkest night and its brightest dawn. His life had become the bridge between two worlds, the imperial dream and the democratic reality. And then that bridge, Japan found balance, pride without delusion, tradition without tyranny. Looking back now, History sees Japan's story not just as a tale of war and loss, but as a mirror held to humanity. Every empire believes it will endure forever. Every nation thinks its cause is righteous. But the truth of Japan's fall reveals a timeless warning that when pride blinds compassion, when faith becomes fanaticism, and when leaders mistake loyalty for strength, ruin follows. The fatal error was not one decision, not one battle, not one bomb. It was a belief that dying for honor was nobler than living with humility. And yet from that error came enlightenment. Japan emerged from its ashes not bitter, but wiser. Its people learned that true strength lies not in conquering others, but in mastering oneself. Its warriors laid down their swords and built a peace that has lasted generations. Its cities became living proof that rebirth is possible, even after unimaginable loss. In the end, Japan's greatest victory was not in battle, but in peace. The same nation that once sought to rule the Pacific now sends aid to disaster zones, builds technology to heal the planet, and teaches the world the value of resilience. The samurai spirit did not die in 1945. It evolved. It became compassion bound by discipline, pride tempered by empathy, ambition guided by wisdom. So when we speak of Japan's fatal error, remember the paradox it left behind. It was a mistake that destroyed millions, yet also gave birth to one of the most peaceful, forward-thinking societies on Earth. The empire fell, but the spirit endured, transformed by fire into light. And maybe that is the final lesson, that no nation, no matter how proud, is beyond redemption, that even in the ruins of arrogance, seeds of humility can grow, that humanity's darkest hour can still give rise to dawn. Because sometimes, history's greatest mistake becomes its most powerful teacher.